Hi and welcome to the War Bunker. Today we're going to be looking at H.G. Wells' 1936 film called Things to Come. It's a film that I managed to recently watch again on YouTube. Uh, I was much impressed with. Now, I'd heard about this film growing up in the 70s. A lot of sci-fi anthology books talked about it. Uh, and today really I'm going to look at it more, not just from its point of view as science fiction, but really from the historical, a little bit from the historical aspect to it. Um, it is based in 1935 and predicts a massive world war in the 1940s. Um, Now, obviously, it's seen as quite prophetic for the Second World War. H.G. Wells was quite shocked, obviously, by the First World War. He'd predicted some things, for instance, the takeoff of air power as being a factor that would become prevalent in warfare in his in his book, sorry, the War in the Air, and likewise he predicted a kind of tank in his the Ironclads. Um, so he looked really at a future war with a good period of dread, and that comes across in the film. It, the Great War that had come before, from 1914 to 18, had been probably one of the first wars on what's called an industrial scale, where just the war just went on and on and on for years. It ground up manpower, resources, um, on a scale that had never been seen before. Total mobilization of a country's economy to basically fund a war. And looking at the huge strides that have been made in science and technology, unfortunately in quite a negative way, to kill the first attacks on civilians, the first aerial bombardment from things like blimps on London. Um, it was quite terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying to the people of the day. And looking forward to the next war, not like looking forward to, oh my gosh, wouldn't it be great if we had another war, but kind of projecting that forward. It was seen very much that the Second World War would pretty much be game over. It's kind of interesting to me, having grown up in the 70s and 80s, where we looked at the Third World War in much the same, and we were taught actually in school about how our survival chances will be next to zero for civilization, um, should there be a Third World War, nuclear war, and that's very much the theme of Things to Come. Um, Showing basically society unraveling itself. Um, there are some really impressive scenes actually of Art Deco tanks and a war in the air, bombing on a massive scale, and it shows a war that just goes on and on and on and on. Pretty much how the First World War had felt, but this going on over decades, and a war of attrition where 20, 30 years later, it's being the war's being fought with much more primitive weapons than it had started with. So tanks are gone. No one can fly anymore because no one can get petrol or rubber. They're basically, as the war has progressed, the industrial capability to continue that war has degraded and degraded so differently to how we think of the First and Second World War, where the weapons that were used towards the end of both those wars were a massive improvement on how we started. The H.G. Wells' vision of a Second World War sees almost going down to the point of bows and arrows, medicine almost wiped out, being able to fly almost wiped out. It's a chilling, absolutely chilling vision. There's even the reason, guys, just find this film out. I managed to find it on YouTube. I will add it to the link below. Um, The copyright on this film is varies from one country to another, so I'm afraid that some people won't be able to watch it in their country. But there, there, there's a kind of zombie epidemic that comes out. I kid you not. This is a 1930s film, but there's a sickness that comes out uh, as society unravels, medicine goes backwards, and people get ill with this thing called the wandering sickness that makes them walk around zombie-like, infecting people unless they're shot. It's pretty grim, uh, and when you describe it, that is quite hokey as well. But in actual fact, quite terrifyingly, this actually had its roots in real history, where um, we had the huge Great War of 1914 to 18. But then, about a few months after the end of the war, in about 1918 to 19, you had this epidemic called the Spanish flu, uh, a very virulent virus that wiped out more people than the Great War. And what's quite kind of interesting is that we're getting better at talking about it, but it was this huge historical event that almost got forgotten. It felt, almost overshadowed by the Great War, but and yet it killed more people than the Great War itself. So again, this wandering sickness had its roots in this fear of as war had progressed, as as countries had mobilised and moved around and then demobilised, that all kinds of sickness and viruses had gone round and mutated, uh, and the medical capacity had decreased. So society's at a pretty much a low point. It's I think in the world of 1966, according to Things to Come, is shown as pretty much your zombie apocalypse dystopia. Um, War's still going on. There are brigands and warlords who've taken over, and things seem quite bad. And then out of the blue, um, there's all of a sudden this kind of different nation called Wings Over the World, who and they're all the technocrats, and they're going to make things okay, and they're going to teach people to put away their bombs. They've learned how to fly. They fly with peace. Um, yeah, a bit of a weird point in the movie, but yeah, that they're this huge empire built on science. And at this point, they take over, and the film tries to end on a bit of an optimistic note, showing the rebuilding process of civilization now that the scientists are in charge, which is a little over optimistic. It would be nice if scientists were in charge, but H.G. Wells had this great idea that of things like eugenics and put science in charge. And sadly, some of his ideas were actually put into place, um, but more by the Nazis themselves. And he was quite shocked, I believe, when he realised that eugenics. He had quite innocent ideas about eugenics, breeding better men and a better future. But then, of course, a civilization like the Nazis take it to the extreme, where they butcher anyone that they think is different and try and it's quite horrific. Um, and indeed the way that they would pervert science. Um, but the final part of the film is all about this new utopia of science, and they're trying to launch a rocket to the moon. This bit of the film doesn't really quite make as much sense as the rest of it, but it's an interesting vision of the future. And there's basically a huge uprising as people don't want people. The general population don't want this moon trip, and they want to smash this. The moonshot's actually done by a giant gun, folks. It was quite a popular idea at the time, and they basically want to go and smash it. The rulers are no, no, no. We've got to launch this thing, and pretty much ends like that. But the interesting thing is, my grandmother used to talk about this film a lot, and particularly about how terrifying it was. Now, obviously, a world descending into a a zombie apocalypse dystopia from a giant war is pretty terrifying. And in actual fact, watching it again, there's some things in there that would shock, I think, even audiences today. One of the key things, when they show air raids, they show that a lot of dead children, which is quite shocking for today, but for 1930s that was really kind of, oh my goodness. Um, Probably one of the things that H.G. Wells got wrong was the sheer efficiency, I guess, of his air forces. They come along and they bomb a town, and they pretty much destroy the entire town in one bombing. It's very, very dramatic, um, because you see people just die all over the place. Of course, in real life, this was based on this theory called the bomber always gets through, which was the idea of strategic bombing. It would always get through. It would always, and whole wars could be fought in future just with air power alone, which is a doctrine that's still very popular. It's certainly used a lot by uh, America and Britain, but in actual fact, there has never been a war so far that we've managed to just bomb another country into submission yet. Um, it's still a nice theory on paper, but not really happened. And really, you see that not only from the devastation as the Second World War starts in things to come, but also with the Wings on the world over the world, who kind of uses gas of peace that knocks everyone out, and then they take over. In the real World War, of course, what would be found is that bombing was highly inaccurate, and that typically you'd be lucky if 10% of your bombs even got within 10 miles of its targets. Never mind all of them arrive and flatten the thing. Never mind all your airplanes get through to bomb. But for a dramatic point, of course, it's really shocking to see this town just completely leveled. It's almost it's on a par, I think, with some of the um, Third World War apocalypse things like Threads, if you ever see that, which talks about shows a nuclear attack on Sheffield. That was a very shocking film, which we were made to watch in secondary school. Now, obviously, it was a piece of science fiction. Some of it's quite prophetic, but it definitely took a grip in the mind of the people at the time. Certainly, as I said, my grandmother was quite shocked by this. Interestingly enough, what she also found unnerving and difficult was the idea of the future world as well. Uh, they have things that to us would just seem quite normal. Television sets, projectors. She always would go on about this guy who a a kind of radio watch that he could speak into, and it was like a phone, which of course, with our modern age and smartphones, that doesn't scare us. But it was quite shocking to my grandmother, the thought, which again is echoed in the third part of, how far could we go? What could we do? What is there any limit to what we could make, build? Which, considering, I suppose, when you consider that force to build and create can be used both to create things like smartphones, but it can also be used to create things like drones that attack people. It shows that science is a double-edged sword. Of course, in this, it's pretty much shown that in the H.G. Wells version, Science is good. People that do science are great. Trust people that do science. Um, but I think maybe my grandmother more clocked onto the idea that it can be quite. There are some things that can be built which can't be unbuilt. And of course, a great example would come after the Second World War. In fact, it ended the Second World War, and ideas like the atomic bomb, something that quite frankly scares the shit out of most people. In fact, when you think about it, the level of destruction is pretty close to what H.G. Wells is kind of fearing for his Second World War in this film. A, a weapon so dreadful that can cause so much damage that it has the potential to unravel civilization as itself, which is quite a terrifying thought, really. And thank God that since uh, since the two that were used in Japan, we've never actually seen it used on civilization again. Anyway, so that's a sum up of things to come. A film I would recommend watching if you're interested in science fiction and want to see some really old science fiction. It's does actually stand up pretty well. If you want to know how people would have felt about the dawning of the Second World War, some of the fears, it kind of it's a good way. This was, as I said, people like my grandparents was very much in their mind throughout the Second World War. Um, a very terrifying vision of what was to come. Thankfully, things in the second, as bad as the Second World War was, it never was quite as bad as H.G. Wells portrayed them in things to come. But it kind of prepared, it kind of prepared. It kind of said, "Hey, this is what the next war could be like." Do find it out. I think on both those levels, it's well worth seeing. Um, and enjoy. If you've seen it and you've got an opinion, look down in the comments and do comment. And also, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks, and catch you later.